The perimeter alarm went off at 2 in the morning, which meant someone was bleeding somewhere I hadn't planned on being. I'd been on Veldrath for 11 weeks by then. Compact Auxiliary Field Medic, attached to the Border Stabilization Unit at Outpost Keth 7, which was a dignified name for 4 prefab modules bolted together at the edge of a contested mineral corridor, where 3 factions had been arguing over survey rights for the better part of a decade. My job was to patch up the people who ended up on the wrong side of that argument. I was good at it. I was also very tired, and I had been awake for 19 straight hours before the alarm went off. I pulled on my kit vest in the dark, didn't bother with the light, and went out into the Veldrath night. The planet had 2 moons, one pale and close, one distant and rust-colored, and on clear nights they made enough combined light to see by. It wasn't a clear night. There was something like fog coming off the mineral flats to the east, low and chemical-smelling, the kind that stung the back of your throat if you breathed too deep. I'd learned to breathe shallow out here. Most things on Veldrath you learn to do in a smaller, more careful way than you'd done them anywhere else. Sergeant Mav Corin was running toward me from the eastern line, which told me the problem was out that way. "Got a situation," he said when he reached me, breathing hard. Mav was a compact man, dark-skinned and calm under fire, 3 years on Veldrath to my 11 weeks. He didn't use the word situation lightly. "How bad?" "Unclear. Someone came through the wire on foot. Guards picked her up about 40 meters outside the east barrier. She's alive. That's about all I can tell you." "Hurry." He met my eyes. "You'll see." I followed him to the eastern gate. 2 of our guards were standing very still over a figure on the ground, and even from 15 meters I could see why they'd called me first and asked questions second. The figure was large, larger than either of the guards, and wearing what had been, at some recent point, armor. The armor was badly damaged. There was blood on the ground under her, a significant amount of it. I knelt beside her and opened my kit. She was Veldrath. I recognized the bone structure, the slight ridging along the jaw and the brow, the way the ears came to a firm upward point. But she wasn't like any Veldrath I'd seen at the outpost or in the border markets. Her skin was a deep bronze violet, the color of storm metal or the mineral ore at the edge of the eastern flats, and it had a quality to it, not a shine exactly, but something that caught the moonlight differently than ordinary skin. Her hair was copper black, thick and heavy, pulled into a warrior's braid so complex it looked structural. Several pieces of the braid had come loose in whatever had happened to her. The armor was Veldrath military grade, high-end, the kind the border militia didn't wear. There were marks on it I didn't recognize, not unit insignia, something older looking. She was unconscious. 2 puncture wounds on the right side, just below where the armor had been struck, the kind of wounds that came from a close-range energy bolt at an angle. Her breathing was present but shallow. She'd lost a lot of blood. I worked. I didn't think about who she was while I worked, because that was the only way to do the job. You take what's in front of you and you treat what you find, and you make the decisions the situation requires. The questions come after. Mav crouched beside me. "Orders." "Get her inside, carefully. I need the med tent, not the main module. The tent's sterile and I've got more room." "Got it." He started directing the guards. "Mav," he looked back. "I don't know who she is yet. Until I do, nobody goes in or out of the tent except me. That's not security, that's medicine." He nodded and didn't ask why, which was one of the things I liked about Mav Corin. She survived the move to the med tent. Her vitals stabilized around the time I finished closing the second wound. I worked under the surgical lamp for what turned out to be 3 hours. I didn't look at the clock until I was done, and when I finally sat back on my heels and looked at the full picture of what I'd done and what she'd looked like when I'd started, I was satisfied with the outcome. Satisfied was the strongest word I allowed myself during the work. It kept things from getting ahead of themselves. She was going to live. I cleaned up, disposed of what needed disposing, washed my hands twice at the utility basin. Then I pulled up the med tent's second stool and sat beside her and started thinking about the questions. The armor marks. I'd taken the remaining pieces off to access the wounds, and they were sitting in the corner of the tent now, stacked in order of removal. I went and got the largest piece, a shoulder plate, and brought it back to the light. The marks were a crest of some kind, 3 vertical lines descending from a horizontal one, with a symbol below that I didn't have a reference for. I'd seen a lot of Veldrath faction insignia in 11 weeks. I'd seen the border militia, the territorial council signatories, the independent survey cooperatives. I hadn't seen this one. I sent the image to the outpost's reference terminal and went back to sit beside her. The answer came back in about 4 minutes, which was either very fast or told me something about how broad the category was. The reference terminal had matched the crest against its Veldrath governmental archive with a confidence percentage of 91. The crest belonged to the House of Veldrath Prime, the sovereign house. I read the entry twice. Then I looked at the woman on the cot in front of me, breathing evenly now, her copper-black braid partially unraveled across the pillow I'd put under her head, and I thought about what that meant. There was one sovereign in the House of Veldrath Prime. The reference entry confirmed it. Her name was Rassiel. She had held the Veldrath sovereign seat for 9 years since her mother's death. She was 34 years old in Veldrath terms, which converted to something like 38 standard, roughly my age, though Veldrath aging worked differently. She had been in a border territorial dispute, the same one Outpost Keth 7 existed to help arbitrate for the better part of her reign. She was also, by my current read, approximately 8 hours from being able to sit up unassisted. I set the terminal pad down on the equipment table and looked at her for a moment. Then I did what a field medic does at 3 in the morning, when a patient has been stabilized and the acute crisis has passed. I got the second blanket from the storage locker. I sat down on the stool beside her cot. I set my bioscan alert to go off every 40 minutes if anything in her readings shifted, and I settled in to keep watch. I didn't know exactly how she'd ended up outside our eastern perimeter. The armor damage suggested she'd been in a firefight. The direction she'd come from east, off the mineral flats, suggested she'd been moving away from something, not toward us. People who moved toward the compact outpost did it openly, from the road that came in from the north. People who came across the mineral flats in the dark, on foot, were either desperate or being pursued, and the armor damage suggested the former if not both. Whatever had happened out there, she'd made a decision. She'd come toward the lights of Outpost Keth 7, and she'd made it to the wire. I found I didn't have a great deal of additional context beyond that, so I sat, and I monitored, and I let the night go by. At 43 minutes she moved. Not awake, just the kind of movement that happens when a body is trying to process its way back from shock. Her right hand shifted on the blanket, fingers spreading and then closing. Her breathing deepened slightly. The bioscan beeped once, adjusted, settled back to its rhythm. I checked the readings. Everything had moved in the right direction. At an hour 20 she made a sound. Low, involuntary, the kind that comes from pain reaching the surface of sleep. I watched her face. The brow ridges, that distinctive Veldrath architecture along the forehead, had drawn together. I leaned forward. "You're in a medical tent, you're safe, you don't need to wake up." I wasn't sure if she could hear me. I said it anyway, because in 11 weeks of field medicine I'd learned that people often can hear you at the edge of sleep, and having something to hold onto, a voice, a calm one that wasn't panicked or issuing orders, was its own kind of medicine. Her face eased, the brow ridges smoothed out, the hand on the blanket unclenched. I sat back. At some point around hour 3 of the watch, without planning it, I fell asleep on the stool. That was what happened. I wasn't dramatic about it then, and I'm not going to be dramatic about it now. I was running on 19 hours before the alarm and 3 hours of surgery, and the stool was against the wall, and the tent was warm, and her readings were stable. My body made a decision my mind hadn't gotten around to making. I came back to consciousness because of the silence. The bioscan was still running. The soft pulse of it was the first thing I oriented to. Readings were fine. The surgical lamp was still on, dimmed to its overnight setting. The 2 moons had moved. The second one was visible now through the tent's small upper vent, the rust-colored one, lower and warmer than it had been. The reason for the silence was that I had stopped being alone in the stool against the wall. At some point in the hours since I'd fallen asleep, Rasil, sovereign of Veldreth Prime, had shifted on the cot and found the warmth of the nearest solid object, which was me, and had pressed her shoulder against mine and was sleeping against my side. Her head was not quite on my shoulder, but it was at an angle that suggested it was thinking about it. I went very still. The first thing I did, quietly, was check the bioscan. Her readings were excellent. Better than excellent. The stress indicators had dropped substantially from the levels they'd been at when I closed the wounds, which was consistent with the kind of physical and neurological settling that happened when a body felt safe enough to let itself begin the real work of healing. I had seen this in the field. People healed better when they weren't afraid. It was not complicated medicine. The second thing I did was sit completely still and not move. Not for any performed or sentimental reason. For a practical one. She was a patient who had been in shock 4 hours ago and was now in the best physiological state she'd been in since she'd crossed the wire. Whatever I might have thought about protocol, about the proper configuration of a field medic and a sovereign head of state, about the report I was going to have to write in the morning, and what compact logistics was going to say about it, none of that mattered the way her bioscan did. Her body had found something that was helping it heal. I was not going to interrupt that. I settled my back more firmly against the tent wall, kept my breathing even, folded my hands in my lap. Outside, the outpost was not entirely quiet. Veldrath nights rarely were. I could hear the distant hum of the perimeter's power cells, the occasional low exchange of voices at the eastern guard post, the chemical flat wind coming off the mineral plains to the east. Normal sounds. Night watch sounds. And then I heard a new sound, which was the soft release of tent fabric as someone opened the med tent flap from the outside. I turned my head. Mav Corin was standing in the tent entrance. Behind him, visible in the gap of the flap, were 4 others. They were not compact auxiliary. They were Veldrath. Tall, armored, the same high-quality military gear as the armor I'd cut off the woman beside me, and they were wearing the same crest on their shoulder plates, 3 lines descending from one, the symbol below. Royal Guard. They'd found her, tracked her here maybe, or picked up the compact distress signal, or simply known where she'd been going. There were 8 of them, I saw now as the flap opened wider. 8 large Veldreth Royal Guard soldiers in full armor, with the kind of weapons that said they hadn't come to negotiate, and they were stacked up behind Mav in the narrow entrance to my med tent. Then they got a look at what was in the tent. All 8 of them stopped. I watched them take it in, the surgical lamp's overnight glow. The bioscan panel on the equipment table, readings displayed in soft blue numerals. The cot against the far tent wall, the woman on it breathing steadily, her copper-black braid half undone across the pillow, the clean bandaging visible at her right side. And me, 38 years old, dark-haired, unshaven, still in the kit vest I'd pulled on when the alarm went off, sitting against the wall of my own tent with the sovereign of Veldreth Prime resting against my side while she slept. Not one of them spoke. Mav looked at me. His expression was careful and controlled, which was Mav's expression for situations he was actively choosing not to have an opinion about. I looked at the Royal Guard. 8 Veldrath soldiers of what I now recognized as the Sovereign's personal detail, weapons out, who had presumably moved at speed, and with considerable purpose from whatever position they'd been in when they lost track of their queen. And they were standing in the entrance of my field hospital tent without making a sound, because the woman they were looking at was sleeping peacefully, and they had not been trained for this. I kept my voice low. She's stable. Wounds on the right side closed 3 hours ago. She's healing. Whatever you need from me, it can happen outside and it can happen quietly. The one at the front, the tallest, with the additional crest mark on her left shoulder plate that indicated a senior command rank, looked at me for a very long time. I held her gaze. There wasn't any hostility in it exactly. There was something harder to name. "You are the medic," she said finally. Her trade language was precise and formal. "You treated her." "Yes." "You were not sent for. You did not know who she was." "I knew she needed surgery. I found out who she was after." Another long pause. She was looking at the bioscan, I realized, reading the numbers because she clearly knew how to read them and because that was the fastest way to confirm what I'd told her. I'd seen that kind of professional efficiency before, on field soldiers who'd learned to verify first and react after. The numbers were good. They were actually very good. By that point, 4 hours of clean healing had moved everything substantially. The commander looked back at me. Her expression had shifted into something I couldn't fully map. She stopped, tried again. "The readings are better than when she came in." "Yes." "Did she?" Another stop. The commander's jaw had a particular set to it, the kind I associated with people who were managing more than they were showing. "Did she ask for anything?" I thought about the question. I thought about the careful way I'd said "you're safe" into a space where I hadn't been certain I was heard. I thought about the unclenching of a hand. "She asked to not be afraid," I said. "I did what I could with that." The commander looked at me for a long moment, then at the sleeping figure against my side, and then she did something I had not expected. She stepped back, very deliberately, 1 step, and made a small motion with her right hand. The 7 soldiers behind her mirrored it, a synchronized, precise step backward, outside the tent entrance. The flap settled. Mav let out a breath. He looked at me. "That was." "Go back to your post," I said. "Tell them to hold position outside, no one in the tent." He studied me for another second, then nodded once and went. I sat in the quiet for a while. Rassel slept. Her breathing was even and deep, and the bioscan gave me exactly the numbers I'd wanted to see for the last hour. Her hand had found the edge of my kit vest at some point and was resting against it without gripping, the way people sometimes held onto things in sleep without being aware of it. Her fingers were calloused in the specific patterns of someone who had trained with weapons for years. There was a scar along her left forearm, old and well-healed, that the armor had covered. I did not move. I looked at the bioscan, then at the tent wall, then at the rust-colored moon through the upper vent, which had descended another handspan while I'd been sitting here. Veldrath nights ran about 14 standard hours. It was somewhere past the halfway mark. I had been in field medicine long enough to know what the body's priorities looked like when a person finally felt safe enough to stop managing. The heart rate came down in a particular way, not the drop of sleep alone, but the drop of sleep without the constant low-level vigilance underneath it, the vigilance that most people in difficult situations maintained even in deep rest without knowing it. The breathing changed. The muscle tension in the hands changed. These were not things they taught in the compact medical academy in any systematic way, but 11 years of it had taught me to read them. Her body had made a decision. It had found the edge of my kit vest and decided that was sufficient. I had no strong feelings about that one way or the other, except that the readings were excellent and I was going to keep them that way. I had a report to write. I had protocol to observe. I had, in practical terms, the sovereign of Veldrath Prime in a compact field medical tent at a contested border outpost, and there were people at 3 levels of command above me who were going to have opinions about that when morning came. Morning could wait. The outpost's night watch rotation changed at the 5th hour. I heard the voices at the eastern post, very low, the handoff of the watch count and the equipment check, standard protocol. Mav would have briefed them by now, not everything, but enough to keep the night smooth. Mav was good at that kind of calibration. I stayed where I was. Sometime in the 6th hour, a small ground creature made its way under the tent edge and sat in the far corner for about 3 minutes before deciding the tent wasn't what it was looking for and leaving the same way it came. Veldrath had a lot of small ground creatures. They were mostly harmless and entirely indifferent to the territorial disputes of the species that had come to argue over their mineral flats. I found I appreciated that some nights. She woke at the 2nd hour past dawn. I knew because the bioscan gave a gentle shift in its readings, the change in breathing rate, the spike in alertness markers, and I came back to full consciousness from the half-state I'd been in for the last hour or so. The moons were both down. The tent was lit by the thin early light coming through the vents and by the equipment panels. Rassel was awake. She was not moving, which was either medical caution or situational awareness or both, and she was looking at the tent ceiling with an expression I would have called neutral if I'd had less practice reading people. "You should stay still for a while longer," I said. "Your right side is going to feel worse than it looks for the next few days." A pause, then carefully she turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were pale amber gold, the specific tone of early light on mineral ore, and they had a quality of precise attention that I recognized as the kind people developed when they spent years in positions where everything they noticed and how fast they noticed it was a survival variable. They moved over my face without any visible reaction, taking in what they found. "You are the one who treated me," she said. "Yes." A human, not a question but not a dismissal either, just an establishing statement. Cale Dorn, Compact Auxiliary Field Medic, attached to Outpost Keth 7. "I know what this outpost is," she said. "I was moving toward it." "I know, you came across the mineral flats." "I was fired on," she said, "from the East Ridge. They took out my escort first." A brief pause, 4 of them. "I'm sorry." She looked at me steadily. "You say that as though you mean it." "I do mean it." Another pause. The quality of it was different from the ones before. She was doing something with it, behind those amber gold eyes, and I didn't know enough to say what. "What time is it?" she said. 2nd hour past dawn. You've been here approximately 6 hours. "My guard unit." Outside the tent. They arrived around the 4th hour. I asked them to hold position until you were ready. Her brow ridges, the ridging I'd noticed in the dark, which in the morning light I could see had a slight iridescent quality, the bronze violet of her skin showing something like depth at the ridge lines, shifted upward. Not surprise exactly, reassessment. "You spoke with them?" "Yes." "And they?" "Held position." I paused. "They were concerned." The senior commander read the bioscan herself before she stepped back. Rassel was quiet for a moment. Then, very slowly and carefully, she turned her head to look at the tent entry and then back at me. "You could have woken me," she said. "You were healing. Your readings were good. There was no medical reason to wake you and several good ones not to. I am the sovereign of Veldreth Prime." "You were my patient," I said. "Those don't cancel each other out, but in a med tent the second one comes first." She looked at me for a long time. I held that gaze the same way I'd held the commander's in the dark, steady, not performing, just present. In my experience, the steadiness was what people needed most, and it cost nothing to provide. "You sat beside me," she said, "through the night." "Yes." "You didn't know who I was when you began." "I knew you were hurt, that was sufficient." She turned to look at the tent ceiling again. I watched the side of her face, the strong line of the jaw, the Veldrath bone structure that was architecturally distinct from anything on Earth, but was also, in the most fundamental way, someone's face, someone sitting with something large and not entirely comfortable, which was the particular feeling of having been taken care of when you hadn't expected it. "I am not accustomed," she said, "to waking somewhere safe." She said it without inflection, which was the most direct kind of statement, the kind you made when you'd given up on softening it. "The border has been contested for 9 years, I said. "Yes." "And you've been sovereign for 9 of those years." "Yes." I thought about what that meant. 9 years at the intersection of 3 factions' territorial ambitions, 9 years of being the target and the symbol, and the person everyone watched when they wanted to know how serious things were. 9 years of the kind of nights that ended with you crossing a mineral flat on foot, alone, in damaged armor, bleeding, because your escort was gone and the nearest outpost lights were east, and there was nothing to do but move toward them. "The wounds are going to need attention twice daily," I said. "I can show your medical staff the protocol, but I'd recommend keeping you here for at least 3 days before any kind of transit. Your right thoracic cluster took significant stress. It needs time." "I do not have." 3 days, I said, not harshly, just firmly the way you said things you meant. "Your body can win most arguments, it can't win that one." A very long pause, and then from the corner of my vision something shifted in her face. Not the professional neutrality, not the precise assessment. Something quieter than that and harder to look at directly, which was why I had stayed looking at the tent wall rather than her. "The commander," she said, when she came in. "What did she look like?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about 8 Royal Guard soldiers, armed and purposeful, stopping in absolute stillness in the entrance of a field hospital tent. The senior commander with the read of bioscan numbers, and then the thing that crossed her face that I hadn't been able to fully name. "She looked like a soldier who came to find something dangerous," I said, "and found something she wasn't prepared for." Rasil was quiet. "She stepped back," I added. "All of them did, no orders, just back." I heard her breathe in slowly and then out. "She has been my commander of the personal guard for 7 years, she said. "I have never seen her step back from anything." "She wasn't stepping back from me," I said. "She was stepping back from the situation." "Which was?" I kept my eyes on the tent wall. "You were sleeping. You were safe. Those were the facts of the situation." The silence that followed had a quality to it that I had not heard in a medical tent before, or perhaps anywhere. It had a kind of weight that was not heavy, precisely, more the weight of something settling, of something finding the level it had been looking for. I didn't have better language than that, and I'd thought about it in the years since. "I will stay 3 days, Rasil said. "Good. I will also need to send communications to the Territorial Council. There are matters that have been." "I can get you a secure compact comm channel," I said, "after you've eaten something and the second bioscan is done. Approximately 1 hour from now." Another pause, a different quality this time. "You are a very direct person," she said. "Occupational habit. It is not an unpleasant quality in a physician." "I'll take that." I stood up from the stool, which my back informed me had been a long time in coming, and crossed to the equipment table to begin the second scan. "Dorn," I turned. She was looking at me. The amber gold eyes, the pale morning light through the tent vents, the copper-black braid half undone, and the professional composure that had been in place since the moment she woke and was still in place. And underneath it, something that was also in place. Something that had been there, probably, since long before she'd crossed the mineral flat, which was the thing that a person carried when they had been the one responsible for things for 9 years, and hadn't allowed themselves to put that weight down. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, and she said them the way she'd said the rest of it, directly, without performance, as a statement of a fact she had determined to be true. I nodded once. "You're welcome." I turned back to the equipment table and started the scan. Outside the tent, I heard the Veldrath Royal Guard holding their position in the morning. The 3 days passed. I know that's an abrupt way to say it, but the truth is that the 3 days were a specific kind of time, the kind that doesn't translate well into narration because what mattered about them was the texture, not the events. The twice-daily wound treatments. The calm sessions she conducted from the tent, her voice shifting into a register I hadn't heard from her, the sovereign's voice, formal and exact, the kind of cadence that had spent 9 years being watched for any sign of uncertainty. The meals I sourced from the outpost kitchen, which were nothing impressive, and the way she ate them without comment, which said something about the 9 years. The commander of the guard, I learned her name was Sail Veth, first guard of the sovereign detail, came to me on the second morning. She was taller than me by a full head, which was not unusual with Veldrath, and she had the bearing of someone who had calculated, repeatedly, that she was the most dangerous person in whatever room she occupied. She stood at the tent entrance with her helmet off, which I read as deliberate, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at the bioscan in the dark. "I want to understand what happened," she said. "Medically." "No, I understand the medicine." She paused. "I want to understand what you are." I thought about the question. A field medic. "You are not simply that." It wasn't an argument. Just an observation, stated with the same flat precision as the bioscan she'd read. "I sat with her through the night," I said. "That's all I did." "She has slept 8 hours in the last 3 nights combined before this. I know because I monitor." She held my gaze. "She slept 6 hours here, unbroken." I didn't have anything to say to that. "When we came into the tent," Sail Veth said, "I was prepared for any number of situations. I was not prepared for the one I found." "I know. My soldiers have not spoken about it." "Good. Not because I ordered them not to." She looked at me steadily. "Because they don't have words for it." The wind came off the mineral flat, chemical and dry, moving the tent fabric softly. In the distance I could hear the low hum of the perimeter cells. "She was healing," I said. "I didn't want to interrupt that." Sail Veth was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "She has a court. She has advisors and protocol officers and 3 separate sovereign residential suites, all of them secured. She has not," she stopped. "She has not rested the way she rested here in this tent in a very long time." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just let it sit. "You should know," Sail Veth said, "that my personal guard designation has a traditional function beyond protection. We also provide honest assessment of significant personnel. It is an old function. Most sovereigns don't invoke it." "All right. I am invoking it now, informally for my own records." She met my eyes. "You are the kind of person she has not encountered frequently. I wanted you to know that I know that." She put her helmet back on, inclined her head with a formality that felt entirely different from the Veldrath court protocol I'd read about in the reference file, and walked back to her post. I stood at the tent entrance for a moment, watching the outpost's morning begin. The mineral flats were pale gray in the early light, flat and chemical-smelling as always, and the east ridge was a dark line at the horizon where whatever had happened to Rassil's escort had happened. I looked at it for a while and thought about what it meant that she'd crossed 40 meters of open terrain between that ridge and the wire, alone in that condition, and decided to walk toward our lights. That was a decision made by someone who had assessed the available options and determined that a compact border outpost, a human-run operation, not Veldrath, not affiliated with any of the 3 factions, and therefore not guaranteed to be either friend or enemy, was the better risk than the alternative. I didn't know exactly what the alternative had been. I knew it had been bad enough. There was something in that I was going to keep thinking about for a while. The 3rd day, late afternoon, I cleared her for transit. The readings were excellent across all measures. The wounds had closed cleanly. The thoracic cluster was handling the stress load with what the bioscan called exceptional regenerative response, which was the clinical way of saying her body had done the work I'd asked 3 days for and done it well. I'd seen that before too. Bodies healed better when they weren't afraid. In the 3 days, she'd used the comm channel I'd set up with the precision of someone managing a complex institutional situation from an unexpected location, which was, in fact, exactly what she was doing. I'd stayed out of the comm sessions, giving her the tent to herself for those hours. When I came back for the treatment she was already done, the comm pad set aside, the professional neutrality back in place. I didn't ask about the sessions, and she didn't offer, which was an arrangement that worked well for both of us. On the second afternoon, between the wound treatment and the comm session, she had asked me something I hadn't expected. "What do you do here?" she said, "in ordinary weeks, when no one has come through the Eastern wire?" I thought about the question. Treat injuries, review the perimeter health protocols with the guard detail, consult on the arbitration party's medical clearances when they come through. Is it sufficient work? I'd looked at her. It's the work that's here. She'd considered that for a moment. You chose a border posting. Yes. Why? I'd thought about how to answer. Because the contested places are where the injuries happen, and injuries are what I know how to address. She'd been quiet after that, and I hadn't pushed. But she'd looked at me in a particular way for a moment before the comm session began that I had filed away without a label. I told her the medical summary standing at the equipment table, the same way I'd told it to every patient, with the bioscan results laid out in order, and the follow-up protocol documented for whoever was going to continue the care at the sovereign residence. She listened the way she'd listened to everything I'd said, fully, without performing attention, the way someone listened who intended to retain what they heard. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment. "The Territorial Council session resumes in 4 days, she said. "I know you'll be ready. The compact auxiliary representative is attending the resumed session." She looked at me. "That would be you." I'd known this was coming. I was the senior compact liaison at Keth 7, which meant the resumed council session was in my portfolio whether I'd planned on it or not. Yes. I find I am not opposed to that. I looked up from the bioscan. She was watching me with that amber gold precision that didn't soften or perform, but was also, unmistakably, something other than neutral. "I'm going to write an honest report," I said, "about what happened and how you got here, and what the perimeter situation on the East Ridge needs." I expected nothing less. It's going to say some things about the state of the escort protocols that people on multiple sides of this dispute aren't going to like. Also expected. And it's going to say that the patient recovered well and was cleared for transit on schedule. I paused. That part is good news. Yes, she said, it is. She stood then, carefully, the way I'd shown her to move for the first 3 days, protecting the right side. She was taller than me when she stood, as most Veldrath were, and the bronze violet of her skin caught the late afternoon light coming through the tent vents in a way that the surgical lamp hadn't shown. The copper-black braid had been redone that morning fully, the complex architecture of it back in place. She was wearing a plain field tunic that my supply locker had produced on the first day because her armor was in no condition to wear, and she was the sovereign of Veldrath Prime wearing a standard compact field medic's spare tunic, and she carried that fact with the same composure she carried everything else. "When you come to the council session," she said, "you will sit at the compact table as is appropriate." Yes. "And you will be accurate and direct, as is your habit." Yes. Good. She moved toward the tent entrance and I stepped aside. At the flap she paused and turned back. The amber gold eyes in the afternoon light, the precise attention, and underneath it that other thing. The thing that had no official name in any diplomatic or medical protocol I knew, which was the particular quality of a person who had been taken care of and knew it, and was going to carry that knowledge somewhere safe. The council session, she said, will be long. There are things that need to be said about the East Ridge situation that should have been said years ago. A pause. I intend to say them. I'll be there. She held my gaze for one moment longer, and then she pushed through the tent flap and went out into the late afternoon of Veldrath. I heard the sound from outside. The guard unit reassembling, the precise movement of armored soldiers forming up, and then the silence, which was different from the silence of the night we'd arrived here. This silence had shape and intention to it. It was the sound of 8 Royal Guard soldiers who had been through something they still didn't have words for, standing in formation behind the person they were sworn to protect, and finding that the only appropriate response to that morning in the tent, to the bioscan numbers and the sleeping figure and the human medic on the stool against the wall, was to say nothing at all and mean everything. I stood in my med tent in the late afternoon and listened to it. Then I sat down at the equipment table and started writing the report. I said she arrived at 2 in the morning, which was accurate. I said she had 2 puncture wounds, right lateral thoracic cluster, and had lost significant blood volume, and I described the procedure in clinical terms that would hold up to any medical review. I said the patient had stabilized by the 3rd hour and had been monitored through the night, which was accurate. I said the Royal Guard unit had arrived at the 4th hour and had been directed to hold position, which was accurate. I said the patient had been cleared for transit after 72 hours, bioscan results attached, which was accurate. I wrote all of that. And then I sat for a long time looking at the equipment table, at the second stool against the tent wall, at the cot with the pillow I'd put under her head, and I thought about the report not saying, not because I was hiding anything, but because there is no section in a compact field report for the quality of someone's breathing at 4 in the morning, or for the way a hand rests against the edge of a kit vest without gripping, or for what 8 soldiers don't say when they see their queen sleeping somewhere safe. Those things aren't in the report, but they're the part I remember most clearly. The council session was 6 weeks later, because the East Ridge situation required a preliminary security assessment before the full parties would agree to reassemble, which was the kind of delay these things always generated and which I had learned to account for. I sat at the compact table, which was on the north side of the chamber. The chamber was in the Veldrath Territorial Governance Complex, a high-ceilinged space of pale stone and tall light panels, very formal and very cold in the way that formal governance spaces usually are. The 3 factions' representatives sat at their respective tables. The Veldrath sovereign seat was at the center table, elevated by a single step, which was the Veldrath way of acknowledging the distinction without making it a hierarchy in any direction that would offend the other parties. Rassel was already seated when I came in. She looked, there's only one word for it, restored. The full ceremonial elements of the sovereign bearing, the armor marks visible, the copper-black braid in its complex formal arrangement, the pale amber gold eyes doing the precise work of watching the chamber fill, and cataloging it with the economy of someone who had been doing this for 9 years and had gotten very good at it. She looked at me when I took my seat, across the chamber, and gave me a single brief nod. I nodded back. The session was long. She had said it would be, and it was. The East Ridge situation was addressed in the first hour, as she'd indicated it would be, and the things she said about the escort protocol failures and the perimeter exposure and the faction responsibility were accurate and direct, and several of them were things that the other party's representatives clearly would have preferred not to hear. She said them anyway, without theater, in the same flat, precise register she used for everything that mattered. At the break between the first and second session, Sail Veth found me in the corridor. She told me, the commander said, to tell you that the East Ridge assessment you submitted was the only accurate account of the perimeter situation that any party has provided in 3 years. It was accurate, I said. That's all it was. She is aware of that. Sailveth paused. It is, apparently, rarer than you would expect. I thought about that for a moment. How is she doing, medically? The follow-on treatment was completed as you outlined. She is fully recovered. Good. She also, Sailveth paused, which was the first time I'd seen her pause mid-sentence for anything other than effect. She also asked me to tell you that the spare tunic has been laundered and is available for retrieval whenever you find it convenient. I looked at the commander. It is a field medic's tunic, she said, with the compact auxiliary designation on the left arm. She wore it for 3 days. She kept it. I didn't have immediate language for what that was. I let it sit for a moment. Tell her to keep it, I said. Sailveth considered this. Then, with a formality I was beginning to understand was not ritual but actual, the expression of something real through a particular precise channel, she inclined her head and went back into the chamber. I stood in the corridor for a moment longer. In 6 weeks, I'd thought about that night many times. I'd thought about the mineral flat and the 2 moons and the cold chemical fog, and the work under the surgical lamp, and the stool against the tent wall, and the quality of the silence when 8 soldiers stepped back from a doorway because they couldn't find words for what they'd found. I'd thought about what Sailveth had said, that she had been through many situations, prepared for many outcomes, and had not been prepared for that one. I thought I understood it, not because I'd done anything unusual, but because that was the point. The world Rassel moved through, the contested corridor, the 3 factions, the 9 years of it, the East Ridge and the escort gone and the mineral flat at night, that was a world where things were unusual all the time in the kind of way that cost you. The medical tent had been ordinary. The stool against the wall had been ordinary. A field medic doing what field medics do, for whoever needed it, for no other reason. Sometimes the ordinary thing is the one that lands the hardest. The session resumed. I went back to my seat at the compact table. Across the chamber, at the elevated central seat, the sovereign of Veldrath Prime was preparing her notes for the second session's agenda, the amber-gold eyes doing their precise work, the copper-black braid in perfect order. She looked up once briefly and met my eyes. And then she turned back to her notes, and the session began, and we both did the work that the situation required. Which was, as it turned out, the only common language either of us had ever really needed.